Suicide Cross-Culturally by Hannah Shepard. This presentation will examine and explain the different rates of suicide in different cultures, which is commonly known as suicide cross-culturally. But first, we'll talk about Emil Durkheim. He focused his career on researching suicide. Emil Durkheim wrote a book called Suicide. It was the first methodological study of a social fact in the context of society. What does that mean? It means that Durkheim wanted to look at suicide, a known occurrence in society, and do it scientifically. He wanted to break the social causes of suicide, back them up with research, and present them to the greater world via this book. Durkheim's main argument was that suicide is not an individual act, as was previously thought by leading scientists of his time. Accordingly, his theory was that suicide was a social fact that was tied to social structures. He defined suicide as a social fact because it was something that happened driven by social causes. However, hidden they were. In order to test his theory, he studied suicide rates across time and place, throughout Europe and spanning over many years. Once he had completed his preliminary research and analysis, he came to the conclusion that despite major differences in suicide rates between individual societies, rates within a society remained stable over time. By looking at this table from Emil Durkheim's book, Suicide, we could see that over the years, each type of suicide has a relatively stable rate in each place. The numbers may vary across the places, but for each place, there's consistency. Durkheim then proceeded to theorize 3 different types of suicide that are found in all societies. These include egotistic suicide, which results from lack of integration of the individual into society. This means that a person is not included in many things that happen in society. They feel unattached, helpless, and useless. Due to these feelings of inadequacy, the person takes his or her own life. The next type is altruistic suicide. It results from the individual's taking his own life because of higher commandments. This means that the individual feels that something larger than himself is causing him to take his own life, such as religious martyrs or suicide bombers. The next is anomic suicide, which results from lack of regulation of the individual by society. This means that the society is going through some sort of change, where the rules of the society are not as clear as they were. The individual feels confused and does not know how to handle the major changes occurring around him or herself, and then, thus, commits suicide. But enough with Durkheim for now. There are many different reasons for committing suicide in different parts of the world. Here in America, it might not be acceptable to kill yourself if your husband dies, but in other countries, that is totally acceptable and actually frowned upon if you don't. The association of socio-demographic and economic variables with national suicides has been best analyzed using factor analysis. 2 researchers identified 2 clusters of variables that appear to be associated with national suicide rates. One cluster had the highest loading from the Islam religion, and the second cluster assessed economic development. Lower suicide rates were found for nations with less economic development and where Islam was the dominant religion. In a similar study of cross-national suicide rates in 72 countries, a researcher identified 13 independent orthogonal factors for the social variables, only one of which was associated with suicide rates. This factor was economic development, with high loadings from such social variables as low population growth and high gross domestic product per capita. Even though many people study suicide across cultures and get accurate results, you always have to remember some logistical facts. A researcher has noted that one explanation of national differences in suicide rates is that the national populations differ in the proportion of those at risk for suicide. For example, typically in developed nations, suicide rates are highest among the elderly, especially elderly males. Therefore, nations with a higher proportion of elderly males will have a higher suicide rate.